So one problem I was having when reading this book is I just kept having this feeling. I can't put words behind this emotion that I've had. I guess it's hard for me to articulate how I felt about parts two and three.
I would agree with that sentiment. I think for me, I kept comparing it to Dostoevsky's other works.
Well, I think that's kind of
Maybe
unfair
it's
though,
not fair to
right?
compare it to those
Yeah.
novels, but it just you're naturally going to compare works from an author to their other works, right? I mean, that's what I
Well,
do a lot of
if you
times.
look at but if you look at the techniques, what he does in those books is you have an overarching plot that moves everything forward, right? And I think this is getting to why I felt the way about this book. Is like even in like horror, the way they make progress is like there's like evenness and then there's tension building, tension building, tension building, and then there's like a release. But then the new floor is a little bit higher and they build tension and tension and tension higher. And then when they drop it again, the floor is even still higher. So it's like you get this progress even when it comes to like emotion for how it gets ratcheted up. And I will say a lot of how I feel was articulated really well in this book right here. Okay. There's a novel by Elizabeth Dalton called The Epileptic Mode of Being, which she kind of took like that phrase from like another writer. But she says the novel also shows this epileptic pattern in its larger structure. The action seems to progress unevenly in waves of tension that gather and burst in climactic scenes of spectacular emotional violence, leaving the narrative energy of the novel depleted and for a time directionless until a new wave of tension begins to accumulate. And I can't help but wonder, like, did we start with like this incredible tension and then we had like either back down to where we started all over again? And then book two, she even quotes as saying, feels like the beginning of a new novel. And I was like, yes, yes, like we do get the info dump like in the beginning of part two. And then you get this build up and then directionless. Again, it's almost like these short stories that were combined almost that didn't ratchet up or complete this arc that we're so used to with how Dostoevsky writes novels.
So you think that the main issue is the episodicness of it? I don't know if that's a word that maybe was kind of a detriment to this novel in particular because it feels like it's more character driven than the others a little bit, which is kind of weird to say because the others are so character driven, and that the overarching plot is kind of not lackluster, but giving you too much in the beginning and there's nothing to kind of coast on through the rest of the story. I could see
Well,
that.
I don't think that's it at all. I think
No?
I don't. I really think it has something to do with how Dostoevsky one wrote it, but also so yes, I guess on some levels I agree, but also I think it's deeper where this is reflective of his whole struggle with epilepsy and an epileptic attack and how it kind of destroys a lot of the progress that you're having and leaves you aimless. And I guess to an extent I do kind of agree too. So I take back kind of what I said, but it leaves the novel without as much structure. And I know that's how he wrote it, right? Like he was writing it as the pieces came out. It was released periodically, to your point. But I don't think they're ever constructed to be, he never intended to be like, I'm going to write this and then combine it with that. Like saying it's episodic might be maybe the wrong word choice, but clearly the crafting and overarching structure is missing. But that reinforces the point of it being kind of like this epileptic attack where afterwards you're just destroyed and emotionless. So I guess the question is no structure an acceptable form of a structure for a book?
I like that. I say I struggle with parts two and three. I think, like many people in the read along, and maybe just many people in general that are reading this and dissecting and analyzing it. But I think that that's a good change of pace. It makes you outside of your comfort zone. It's going to make you grow as a reader and a person, and to be able to experience something that is impossible for us to understand, an epileptic seizure or having that, debilitating disease, and being able to experience that through literature, I think is kind of a gift.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Dostoevsky intended this, but one way that you could think about it is in the same way that Michigan is just, he's outside of society, just doesn't get it. He's going to do his own thing, right?
Yeah,
Where
right.
he's a person without structure, right? He's a person without the structure and expectations and normalcies of what society expects of him. in the same way that this is kind of the same thing for a book. It's not behaving the way a book normally behaves. And does that make it not a book? Does Mishkin become not a person because he doesn't perform the way his local cultural society expects him to? And I don't think it's comparable, apples to apples, but it is an interesting thought progression of, where do my judgments enter and where does essence begin?
What if we read this book in a different order? Would the novel still make sense? What if you started with part 2 and it was almost like sometimes in movies where they start you off in the middle of the story and then they're like, and 6 months before, and it's almost like you get a prequel. If you started with book 2, I think about it, you would be okay. You would be a little bit confused of who all the characters are and stuff. But then if you put part 1 as part 2 and it ratcheted up and it fit that norm of structure that you're talking about, I think people will, quote, enjoy it more, but I think you would miss the point of the novel. So that's where it comes back to of, your personal enjoyment of the novel and maybe a point that can be taken, whether it was his intent or not, Dostoevsky's intent or not. I don't know. But I think that you could take it either way. That'd be interesting.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's talk about what happens in part 3. We'll do a quick summary, then kind of have our discussion and analysis on it, and then we'll move into part 4 after that and wrap up this series.
All right, make sure you keep it short so I don't fall asleep.
Because Hippolyte fell asleep during Radomski's speech. Okay, I see what you did there. All right, plot number 3. They head to Pavlovsk Vauxhall, a public hall where music is played, where, surprising, Nastasia enters once again to cause havoc. She approaches Radomsky once again about his rich uncle embezzling funds and committing suicide. Anastasia even exchanges words with a local man and is about to be struck when once again Mishkin steps in and takes the hit upon behalf of the woman. All similar things that we've seen before. Does it maybe feel taxing? I don't know. Maybe having epileptic seizures is supposed to feel taxing, and maybe he did intend for us to feel this way. I don't know.
That repetitive nature, yeah.
Yeah, but there's this threat of a duel that never happens. And when Mishkin finally returns to his house, there's a surprise birthday celebration for him. Lebedev gets drunk and discusses fun party topics like famines and cannibals.
I love how you put fun in the notes. I was like, oh, okay, we have different definitions of fun there, Una and Dostoevsky.
All right, so Hippolyte wakes up during a big speech. Don't you dare fall asleep on me, sir. And enters into his long essay speech on his final conviction, aka his suicide letter. Upon finishing it in painstaking detail, no one seems to really have any empathy for Hippolyte.
I did.
In the party, the characters in the scene were just kind of like, okay.
Yeah, well, they're terrible people.
All right, so he attempts to pull a gun out, but it wasn't loaded properly again. Climactic climax of the scene. This is the epileptic emotional seizure, the way that Dostoevsky wrote each of these parts. And Lebedev reveals someone stole a 500 ruble note from him. Party's over, people. Mishkin goes to the park where he meets Aglaya, and they discuss a letter from Nastasia that says she wants the two of them to get together. Rogozhin comes along and carts Nastasia away. End part 3. Dun, dun,
dun. So we get a little bit of, excitement there at the end, but it took a while to ramp up to that, right?
Well, it's kind of hard to say I assume you're talking about the Rogozhin part for the excitement.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, what's going to happen? Because I know something's going to go bad at this point in time. It has to. But what are we going to get? Who's going to die? Who's going to survive? Where's my not happy ending after?
Well, let's say this. This part opens with this weird, brief monologue that I think is kind of, to me, thematically important, where he talks about practical change, right? What's it going to take to change Russia? We all agree we don't love the way things are going right now. There's problems, right? And he highlights that through characters in the books representing ideas and issues with egoism and nihilism and such, and even problems with how does Christianity fit into this world? But how do we go about changing that, right? Do we just gut everything and start over? Do we really just change what Russia is in this whole Slavophile versus Westernization conversation that seems to kind of just be a rotating topic in Russia at the time?
I thought about this of Mishkin, he lacks the intellectual sensibility to make a difference, and he can't recognize the deception that's happening through the entire novel and specifically here in part 3. And I don't know, is he trying to say, Dostoevsky saying, hey, this is how we're going to achieve paradise, this is how we're going to fix everything, is through just the naive beliefs of going along what we've always done? Or is there going to have to be action taken to make a change?
Well, that's a good point, because when it comes to naive beliefs, it goes always, right? Like Dostoevsky isn't blind. Like he's obviously pro Russian Orthodoxy, right? And we'll get to that in part 4. Throw some daggers across the board there, but
he is not subtle about it either.
But he's not naive to the problems of issues exist all over for how do we make this better? Because anytime he makes someone just a blind, devout follower, a devotee, or even representation of a movement in the novel, that character just doesn't work. Like anyone who's just a straight nihilist just doesn't make sense, isn't able to produce anything in this book. But even Mishkin, who's kind of the perfect, I don't want to say he's perfect, but he's kind of the second coming of Christianity. He's trying to be this good, kindness, caring person, doesn't have the intended effect when he's like 100% in one bucket. And it's just like, is there admission here that maybe societies are complex in the same way that individuals are complex? It's not just the Theseus ship of replace this individual with someone else and society works, right? We've got to fix small things. And how many things do you start fixing before Theseus's ship, when you take out one wood plank and replace with another, how many wood planks do you take out and replace before it's no longer his ship? In the same way, how many times do you change who you are and what Russia is before it's no longer that person and no longer Russia?
And there's kind of the 3 big things that they're looking at, topics. Of course, there's the intellectual viewpoint, then there is the spiritual viewpoint, and mixed in that is that third of, do your morals come from your intellect or do your morals come from your spirituality? And Mishkin, I think, is battling with that throughout the entire novel.
You know, and he throws a lot at the reader here, right? There's small sections here about the women question, right? He does have the women like, well, why aren't you just focusing on marriage? Like, why are you reading books? Like, it's kind of like the Belle from Beauty and the Beast problem. And, you know, obviously we talked about Radomski kind of representing the liberalization. Where does goodness come from, to your point? Is it something that you create? Is it something around you?
Well, I mean, thinking of love is unexplainable, right? I mean, it's an emotion that we have that we use that 4-letter word for, but it's impossible to define. And Mishkin is struggling for maybe 2 different types of love between the 2 ladies that he fancies here. And he doesn't know how to make that choice because he lacks, I think, a lot of, you know, the societal norms that we put on what is love or what are you going to accomplish with love, because there is a lot of being selfish with love as well.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out, we aren't experts in, you know, all the philosophical movements happening in 19th century Russia. But we do know that a lot of what Russia was discussing was, you know, morality and where does value come from? How do you create value in one's life? Where does that come from, to the question that you just asked? And it's not until, you know, a couple decades later that Nietzsche finally releases the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which really cemented, I think, some of like the grassroots movements that you've talked about before of nihilism in the area, in Germany, moving into Russia and such. But one of the things that is a topic is that will to power, which is, where does morality come from? And for Mishkin, it's the Christ journey, right? Like, he thinks doing good on a personal level is what creates good. Like, it's just, he's not even like morally driven. It's just what he's instinctually doing. Like, he thinks it's good to show passion and kindness on an individual level.
So he's trying to put out in the world and perpetuate what he thinks he will get back.
I don't even know if he has expectations of return, right? Because if you truly love, I think it comes without expectation of return. And I don't think Mishkin has any expectation, hence why he gives, even when he knows what people want, because he thinks this is truly a good thing. He thinks his value comes from this individual compassion and kindness. And then you have...
his feelings... Yeah, but his feelings for Nastasia, he's trying to save her, right? Because she's so destructive. I mean, she's that character that comes in and just plays that same character over and over. Every time you see him, like, oh, that's the bad guy, because I know that person plays the bad guy. She's the damsel in distress, and isn't he trying to save her? And is he doing that for her, or is he doing that for himself?
Well, can you take on other people's suffering? And we've seen Dostoevsky explore that, I think, more thoroughly in Brothers Karamazov. But yeah, that's absolutely an ideal. And when you look at Nastasia, is she the opposite? Is she the active nihilism where she's trying to create value, but it's through destroying things? And if you destroy it, does it have value? Right? Like that's part of maybe one of the drives that we have with a self-destructive nature. If you can destroy it, is it truly valuable or good for you? And she realizes that Mishkin is, I take it as she realizes Mishkin is good. And if Mishkin is good, most people from an egoist standpoint of what's best for me would want to surround themselves with that, right? Like if I'm with Mishkin, I'll be a good person too, or he'll help me, right? But if you just look at it from a nihilist of what creates value, if Mishkin is good and you add Nastasia, okay, is that still good? I don't know, maybe. But if you take Nastasia away, is Mishkin still good? Yes, Mishkin is good no matter what, with Nastasia being there or not. So therefore, adding Mishkin to Nastasia's life doesn't actually help Nastasia. It doesn't come from this external source, from the internal-external question that you said earlier.
Wow, that's pretty deep. When I think about the story now, looking at it from her point of view, and it being her story and not his. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I think I may be enjoying it retroactively a little bit more, thinking about it of her being like, hey, I can only be good maybe if I'm with Mishkin.
Well, and then when you look at, okay, so let's take a look at that. She's trying to create value. Okay, so that is the master mentality from Nietzsche, who says that you have to, decide what's good or bad for you. Now you take a look at Rogozhin, and he's interesting because, again, his name means horns. Like I literally pictured Snidely Whiplash in my dreams last night. I had a dream about Rogozhin. Don't ask me why. But he.
I want to ask why. I'll ask why off camera. I want to ask why.
But he's the character that shows up and is like, oh, this will be great. But you could tell he's the devil, right? He is the snake that is presenting, oh, knowledge is good, eat this apple and everything will be great. But he's secretly trying to destroy things behind the scenes, right? And that destruction we see isn't creating good. It isn't creating value. And I think this is maybe a way we can look at Dostoevsky's attack on nihilism of just replacing things with good or adding things doesn't actually change the value of what you're adding. So nihilism is not helping Russia in his view.
I struggle with Rogozhin because he knew he was going to do bad, and he's so manipulative, and he's just like, hey, you better, and this is the big foreshadowing moment that I knew something bad was going to happen in part 4, when he's like, well, you better marry me because, I'm basically going to kill you if you don't, or eventually I will. And it's just like, oh, okay, we're not sugarcoating this. Okay, she's dead. We are not getting our happily ever after.
And in part 2, he had like knives out on the counter and he tried to kill Mishkin. Kind of not a guy that I invite to my parties, but they're both very destructive, but still trying to create value. And I think that's what's interesting too. So here in part 3, it's kind of Ippolit's chapter. Like, I don't know, Mishkin and Nastasia and Rogozhin, they're magnetic personalities that we want to pay attention to. And then there's like these like less interesting characters like Ippolit, who is literally dying. He's dying at this party, giving people his farewell letter, and people are like, like I don't care about you. Like literally just ignore a person's suffering and is being ignored by society. I couldn't help but feel for him. On some levels, I even feel for Nastasia. Right? She was abused as a little girl and is looking for some form of control, of creating something. And maybe that's why she's so self-destructive and controlling, is because sometimes people who have had abuse in their childhood need to create structure and control because that's the only thing that they can control. And maybe that's a little bit of how we should look at Ippolit's suicide letter, right? Because he can't control when he's born, but he can control when he dies. Suicide is a form of taking back knowledge in the form of control, of agency. And it's the only way he knows how to control his life, which otherwise isn't in his control.
I think I've kind of expressed this before, but I think that Ippolit is probably my favorite character he's the one that is giving you a good life advice and message of if you're healthy and happy and you have love and good things, you need to take every opportunity to live life to its fullest. You need to, live for me, because I can't live for myself because I'm going to die. And it just breaks my heart that these people didn't care more about him because no, maybe the medical technology wasn't there, but there's a lot of power in, I think, the positive thinking and if you're surrounded by loved ones and you have good in your life, maybe you'll have a better outlook and be better. And I think that's where like Ippolit and Mishkin, kind of bouncing back and forth as these two characters, they're not mirrors of each other, but they are definitely intertwined together. And it just, oh man, that belief of, you should live your best life. And he's trying, I think. I don't know. I feel so sorry. He ended up being my favorite character.
Well, I think it wraps together what I believe is an attack on nihilism is that it's too impersonal. It's too disconnected from the rest of society, to your point, where when you feel disconnected from society, I think it's a pretty universal thing that you feel lonely, right? Like, I don't think that's a unique statement. And I think Dostoevsky's trying to make that view where we can see one way people do feel connected is when kindness and compassion is at an individual level. Like when you make it personal between you and another person, I think that's when you see characters connecting and growing. And I think that's what maybe Ippolit or even Berdovsky both saw with Mishkin and how they kind of became followers in a sense of him when he showed them individual personalized compassion. And I think that's Dostoevsky's ultimate message about Christianity is you create value through those personal individual moments of kindness.
Yeah, I guess it just made me mad because both Mishkin and Ippolit are ostracized in certain ways throughout the story. And because Mishkin is overtly good, that theme of that goodness just comes out again. And poor Ippolit just gets the short end of the stick. I mean, they're both outcasts, but I guess that is the point of that. If you do this, you can overcome the outcastness that of society will put upon you if you're just that dang good.
Is Ippolit a weak or strong character?
Well, I think he's the strongest, right? He's the one that has the most adversity throughout the novel, in my opinion.
So you'd say he's strong because he's dynamic. Like he learned something and grew, as opposed to a lot of the characters that weren't able to grow or maybe even just make small, minute changes were destroyed.
Yeah. And I don't think it's the level of change that happens, but the significance of the change.
And I think this novel, while we focused a lot on this, there's so many things to talk about, right? We've got impropriety in society, which, if you want like a whole book dedicated that, you got to check out this little book called Anna Karenina, which focuses mostly on that, right? With how the Ipanchins didn't want to be associated with the impropriety of Mishkin living with Nastasia before marriage and all that stuff. You've got a lot of cultural patriotism in this. We read that amazing book, Sanshiro, which you see a lot of Russian nationalism in here and what makes Russia, Russia. In Sanshiro by Natsume Soseki, you had the what makes Japan, Japan during the great, Meiji Restoration era. You've got a lot of books that deal with even society made me do it, right? Are these characters bad because of external circumstances to your internal, external question? And that was a big motivating thing in Crime and Punishment. So,
or, any Charles Dickens novel.
let's move into the summary of plot 4, and then let's kind of talk about our final thoughts on this book as a whole. So rumors surface on Aglaya and Mishkin being engaged. They have a party to introduce Mishkin. Just be cool, kid. Like, don't do anything like destroy my family's priceless Chinese vase. And then he promptly goes on a rant about Roman Catholicism and destroys the priceless Chinese vase. Later, Aglaya brings
Were you excited
Mishkin,
about that? I got a little happy. I don't know about that, but
I thought it was fun. I thought it was funny. Yeah, I thought it was funny. I thought part 4 was pretty entertaining.
Yeah, it ramps back up here a little bit.
Now, later, Aglaya brings Mishkin to the park to call out Nastasia on being a drama queen.
Fair.
Smooth Move Mishkin defends Nastasia in her suffering and leaves with Nastasia. And Mishkin and Nastasia now become engaged. General Evolgin passes away. The wedding day with Nastasia and Mishkin's brought on. Runaway Bride with Rogozhin and Nastasia, where Nastasia just disappears once again. And Mishkin scours Petersburg for her, ultimately finding that she's been murdered by Rogozhin.
Dun, dun, dun.
2 months later, Rogozhin confesses to the murder. Ippolit dies. Kolya has Radomsky get Mishkin back into Switzerland mental institute, and Aglaya marries a con man. And plot.
You knew it was coming. You knew it was going to be an Eeyore ending. You knew it. And he nails it. Like the best, worst ending ever.
Is this a tragedy?
How could you say it's not? Nobody gets a happy ending. Nobody. And very few people have any growth whatsoever that are better off.
Well, what's interesting is, did any of the characters grow to what we were just talking about with Hippolyte? And like, a lot of them didn't. And they went either insane, were conned, were murdered, like bad things kind of happened to a lot of the characters in this book. But like the lack of growth was there, which means the central conflict, which I don't know, did you take the central conflict of what does it mean to be a good person in society? What does it mean to create good, and what is good? Was that even resolved at the end of this book?
I think so, but not in the way that people are going to want to hear. I think that Mishkin is let out into the world to see if he can have an effect on people and make a difference. And I think that Dostoevsky is saying, in my opinion, is that the world is not ready for good yet. We haven't evolved as a people yet to be able to accept that goodness. And the prince fails and has to go back, locked away, and maybe we'll try again in 100 years or something.
Yeah. And it makes you, we just recently read that story where the question was, who's the crazy one here? Is it really Mishkin who got locked away because he was trying to do what he thought was ultimately good? Or is it society for allowing that sort of thing to happen and not allowing good into our lives? Who's the crazy one here?
I think, I don't know. I think it's hard to define crazy, right? I mean, it's perspective-wise of time period and that ideal of Russia and what it wants to be and its identity that's forming. Does it want to come from a place of morality? Does it want to come from a place of religion? Does it want to come from a place of politics? Because they've had so many problems, over the, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries with their czars. I think that Dostoevsky is saying that we still haven't figured it out yet, and we're not even close, but we should keep trying. And that's the point. And that's why I identified so heavily with Ippolit is we keep trying, no matter how dire the circumstances. You got to keep trying and pushing forward. And that's where I kind of took from the novel as a whole.
Do you think there's a couple of big changes in the novel though, right? Like there's a huge knife thrown across the table at Roman Catholicism in this book, right? To the point where like, I imagine there's some people who are Roman Catholic are reading this like, oh my gosh, like I never thought about comparing Roman Catholicism to being worse than atheism when it comes to Christianity. That is kind of a big statement because it reminds me a little bit of his future novel that he hasn't written yet, but with the Grand Inquisitor. We won't go into spoilers of that, but it comes down to the papal claims, right? Where a lot of Russian Orthodox individuals at the time thought the papal claims were actually claims of power, not claims of religion or claims of scripture, but just grabs at power to maintain power and replacing spirituality with political reform, with strength and organizational earthly desires as opposed to spiritual immaterial desires.
I can see that. And I can see that this is kind of, Mishkin being the representation of the church. He fails to save everybody from destruction. And, he kind of just goes on this circular journey over, he's in and out of St. Petersburg, back and forth. He's in and out of, the clinic in Switzerland. And yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's easy to pick out those, attacks on the church of how is that going to help define the Russian people, Catholicism, Orthodox, atheism, where are we going to be as a people?
Yeah. And I think it's even interesting to compare that with our discussion from part 2, where we talked about the old believers, where they said, oh, okay, well, we're going to change these texts to match the Greek Orthodox one because obviously they're different. And they're like, what? No, we're not going to follow that. It's interesting to say, where do you take your faith and your spirituality, and how does that intersect with your organization in your church, right? Like faith isn't the same thing as your spirituality per se, or your church isn't the same thing as your spirituality.
It's interesting that you bring up the term the old believers, because I think maybe some of the only truly change and people that are affected are the young people. If you looked at Vera and Kolia are some of the younger characters in the story, are the only ones that kind of are affected by the goodness of Mishkin throughout the whole novel. So very interesting, that old versus young mentality and belief of religion and how it's evolving along with the people in Russia.
Yeah, and he even throws, Aglaia under the bus by having her marry a Roman Catholic individual who's a con man and cheats her out, like looking for something else besides true spirituality, I guess, in a sense, which, I don't know, a little backhanded there. But
little, very backhanded there.
So let's talk
you
about...
might have called out the Pope by name.
Let's go back to the initial problem statement we've had with this whole book and with Mishkin as a whole, where we said, could he work in society? Let me change the question. What would it take for a Mishkin, a second coming, to work?
I don't, and nowadays, I don't think it can. Everything is too polarizing. You're never going to get people to agree on what the definition of good is, what the definition of right is. You're never going to get people to agree on anything anymore. And that's very disheartening. I think he works even less nowadays than even back then, which is so disheartening. And I think,
I don't know, looking at this, I don't know if back then they agreed much either.
Maybe that's just us as a people. We're just never going to agree. And not necessarily a bad thing. I love having disagreements and having civilized conversations. And I think that's, the point of literature, is to open up our thought process to new ideas and new people and new culture and new everything. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that he doesn't work, because he is such a polarizing figure. Why does it have to work? Not working can bring just as much thought.
Yeah. Well, and maybe it goes back to that point too, is what does it mean for something to work? Does everyone in the society have to agree? Does everyone have to do this? And maybe it comes back to that ultimate message of kindness and compassion having to be personal. And maybe we just have to learn how we make it work for us. How do we make good? And maybe that's just the first step that we take. I don't know. It's an interesting question and an interesting novel, despite my emotions from parts 2 and 3. I don't want to say it was, I love this book. I think it's a great book, but there was something different about the middle. I don't want to say it was slow, but I had these emotions of that epileptic depletion of energy. And is that acceptable as an entertainment side of reading for me? Obviously the discussion well outweighs just looking at a book for entertainment, right? Like that's not the type of channel that we are. We want to take how do we compare this to our lives, and how do we relook and make ourselves better? And I think that's what this book did accomplish. Maybe it wasn't the most on the entertainment side for everyone. Maybe it was your favorite book. I'm not saying you had to look at it that way. But if you could take books and feel inspired, and maybe just take that one individual moment of kindness on a personal level that you can show in your life, I think the book did its job.
I would agree with that. I really liked the book as well. I think that, for me, it was maybe one of the weakest entries, because I kept comparing it to the other Dostoevsky novels, and I shouldn't have done that. I think this would be a great one to start with and then move up to some of maybe his stronger work later in his life. I kept coming back to the idea of, all the religion, and I kept thinking of, is Dostoevsky trying to make us push towards equality here? Does he want all of us to be good and the same? And I come back to one of my favorite short stories of all time, of I don't want to be Harrison Bergeron. I like having, differences, and I like arguing, and I like debating, and I like having discussions. And I think that this book allows us to have that. And I love that the journey is staggered in a way, or it is not the traditional, and that's going to be the uniqueness of this that is going to make it stand out from the other great literary works of anyone. So it's definitely, one of the best novels ever, but it's definitely, for me, was not a Crime and Punishment or Brothers K, or yeah.
Yeah, but if you are looking to hear our thoughts on those, we will leave the playlist down below. We're going book by book through all of Dostoevsky's works, and we'd love to have you join us on future works of his, as well as, if you haven't read his other works and want to hear our thoughts on those. We had some really in-depth and I think really great conversations about Brothers K that, it's my favorite book of all time. So obviously I'm going to have a really good time discussing what its meaning could be to us. So if that sounds like you, playlist down below, subscribe. We look forward to having more fun and discussions on Dostoevsky in the future. Please join us. My name has been Una. Una out.
Peace.